Good evening and welcome, friends. I am Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network, and tonight we have another experience in the Family Room Live series, this time with Dr. Marshall Duke and Dr. Ron Wolfson. So the big news from JGN is, and actually before I even introduce our speakers, the big news from JGN is that the Family Room is now available to you. And I'm going to take one quick moment to show you what the Family Room is. The Family Room is an online space, a virtual space for grandparents, for you to find experiences, activities, and resources that can enrich your relationship with your grandchildren with Jewish culture, values, and traditions. So I'm just going to give you one example. So what you would do is you'd find an area of interest to you and your grandchildren. So let's say, you would choose among the arts, holidays and celebrations, family stories, play, health and well-being, and so on. And I'm going to give you one example of a typical experience. Let's say you wanted to explore the arts. You'd click on the guitar and you might choose one of these experiences, such as taking photos, how you and your grandchildren can take photos together to tell stories about your lives. These experiences, these activities are all asynchronous, meaning you do them in your own time. And there are currently about 60 or more experiences and activities available to you, with more coming every week.
Beautiful.
Two quick notes before I introduce our panelists. The first is, if you have a question, please put it in the chat bar. You are all on mute, and we welcome your questions. It's going to be an informal conversation. We will pose your questions throughout
I understand. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's my absolute pleasure.
Means a lot. Well, what do you think? Well,
questions in the chat bar. The second suggestion is, because we have quite a large group, you may want to consider putting your view in the top right corner where it says view, putting your view to speaker rather than gallery. That way you'll be able to see our speakers up close and personal. Tonight, we are so pleased to welcome our friends, Dr. Marshall Duke, Dr. Ron Wolfson. Ron Wolfson is the Fingerhut Professor of Education at American Jewish University in Los Angeles and the author of 17 books on Jewish life, most recently a book called Raising A+ Human Beings, Crafting a Jewish School Culture of Academic Excellence and AP Kindness. Ron is also Zaidi Ronnie to two delicious grandchildren, Ellie and Gabe. Ron is a member of the JGN, the Jewish Grandparents Network Board of Directors. And then we have Marshall Duke, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Psychology at Emory University and a faculty member with the Emory Center for Myth and Ritual in American Life. Ron's specialty is family stories, and he's the author of numerous articles on the subject. Marshall is grandpa to 9 grandchildren, and quote, "I am blessed for real." Those were Marshall's words. Marshall is also a member of the JGN National Advisory Council. Tonight, Marshall and Ron will be interviewed by the co-founder and CEO of the Jewish Grandparents Network, David Raphael. So over to you, David.
Am I muted still?
You were, but now you're Up and running.
Yeah, you're probably luckier than I was muted. Anyway, welcome everybody. I'm so delighted that you have joined us. I want to welcome everybody, but give a special shout out to my wife, Jo, who is not here with me, but with my grandchildren, which demonstrates how we as grandparents play special roles in the lives of our adult children and grandchildren. I want to, as we begin our conversation with Ron and Marshall, I am mindful of the saying in the song in Hebrew, "Hinei ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad," how beautiful and wonderful it is for friends to sit together. And Marshall and Ron are two extraordinary friends, both to me, to our organization, and to the Jewish community at large. And we're just so grateful for all their support and participation. So I'm going to start out by asking both Ron and Marshall, but maybe for Marshall to begin, talking a little bit about how you came to your roles as storytellers and as studiers of storytellers, and how does that connect with the larger story of your life, or the stories of your life? So Marshall, will you begin?
Okay. Thank you. Good evening. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I always love the opportunity to do anything with Ron and with David, and this is a gift to me as well as I hope to all of you, an opportunity to hear about the stories and the stories that we've been trying to tell and get other people to tell as well. I have been a storyteller my entire life. It came to be that I discovered that stories were very important from an adjustment perspective, or a resilience perspective, only later on when I began doing some research as part of the Center for Myth and Ritual in American Life that Terry talked about. The stories that families tell are widely known to be important, just in terms of, gee, they're interesting, they're fun to hear, they give us something to do with our children, our grandchildren. But the reason I have begun to focus on them is that in the research that we've done here at Emory, beginning after 9/11, with a group of families that we were studying at the time, led us to conclude, after a whole bunch of things, which would take hours to talk about, to conclude that the more children know about their family history, the more resilient they are, the more capable they are of dealing with ups and downs. The capacity to bounce back seems to be related to knowledge of family history. And this is something that we established over a period of about 12 years in the Center for Myth and Ritual in American Life. We began studying families and asking the kids simple things like, do you know where your grandfather grew up? Do you know where your grandparents met? Do you know where your parents met? Things that they couldn't know unless somebody had told them. And the people who usually tell them, it turns out, are grandparents. Grandparents are storytellers. When we get the children on their own, or we have special moments with them, it might be a Shabbat dinner, it might be a family dinner, it might be a holiday, a family vacation. We tell stories. We are uniquely prepared and tooled, I guess, to tell stories. And the reason for that is that, as Jane Shapiro, some of you know Rabbi Jane Shapiro, she says that grandparents have a 5-generation wingspan, that we have ourselves, but on one side we have our parents and our grandparents, and on the other side we have our children and our grandchildren. So we are unique in that we stretch, if you really look at it, well over 100 years of knowledge and impact. And so as such, we've got information, we've got stories to tell, and part of our responsibility for the stories and to the stories is that we tell them. And it turns out psychologically, it's a healthy thing to do.
Sure. Ron, you want to talk a little bit about the roles of stories in your life, please?
Well, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, David, and it's always great to be with my friend Marshall and everyone at Jewish Grandparents Network. But in Omaha, my earliest memories are hearing stories at a Passover Seder, after the food was eaten, and the coffee was served, Maxwell House, of course. It was storytelling time. So I thought as a grandson, I would share with you one of my favorite stories about my grandfather that's influenced me to be a storyteller with my own grandchildren. My Zadie Louis stood about 4'9". He was a peddler, came to Omaha, Nebraska because Union Pacific Railroad started in Omaha, peddled fruits and vegetables, became a supermarket owner. 5 families lived off that supermarket. He had a little money, so he had a big screen TV in Bubby and Zadie's house. And when we walked in as a little kid, I would get a handful of Bubby's cookies. Those were mandel bread studded with almonds dipped in cinnamon sugar. And then I'd come around the corner where Zadie was sitting in his big red velvet chair, like a king on a throne. Next to the red velvet chair was a side table that had 3 things on it. His pack of Camel cigarettes, unfiltered, he smoked 4 packs a day. The second thing was this, a silver-plated Ronson lighter. Some of you might remember these. This was my Zadie's Ronson lighter. It was the thing I inherited, only physical thing. I inherited so much more from my Zadie. Third thing on the little side table next to his chair, a glass of water with his teeth in it. There was no ashtray because Zadie put the butts of his cigarettes out in his suit pockets on the arms of the chair in the dash of his Cadillac. How he didn't burn himself up, I don't know. But I'm like 6 years old. I would see him, he would open up these huge legs of his, I would jump in his lap. He'd put me in a leg like a wrestling, one of those worldwide wrestling guys. I was a prisoner of his love, and he would look me in the eye and he would give me a big, wet, scratchy kiss. And he would say to me in his Russian accent, "Honey, you're the best boy in the United States of America." Because he loved the United States of America, gave him everything. I'd say, "Zadie, I know," because he did this every time. I know. No, he'd say it again. "Ronnie, you're the best boy in the United States of America." I know, Zadie, let me go. Third time, "Ronnie, you're the best boy in the United States of America." And finally, he let me go. And then my brother Bobby would come around the corner, jump in Zadie's lap. Zadie would look him in the eye, give him a big, wet, scratchy kiss and say to him, "Bobby, you're the best boy in the United States of America. Dougie, you're the best boy in the United States of America. Laura, you're the best girl in the United States of America." And you know what? I've tried to live the rest of my life to be that best boy. And that's the power of a story. That's the power of grandparenting, to share with our kids the stories of our lives so that they feel connected to a tradition, to a mishpacha, as we say in Yiddish. It's one of the most important things we grandparents can do as Jewish educators. I'm a Jewish educator, like Terry. And Jewish educators' best tool is to tell stories. So all of us grandparents are Jewish educators when we tell our stories.
I'm going to go off script, so I apologize. Ron, you showed us the Ronson lighter, which I've heard about, but I've never seen before. And it's great to see the Ronson later. It's something like out of Raiders of the Lost Ark. But could you talk a little bit, and maybe Marshall as well, about the importance of having items around your house that evoke these stories and evoke these memories, and how the importance of having them for our grandchildren, so that when your grandparents come in, grandkids come in, they see the Ronson lighter, it provides you that opening to share your family story. So Ron or Marshall, perhaps you could talk about that.
Just quickly, I mean, these objects that we have that have meaning and story attached to them are fantastic memory makers. They hold the memories. this book behind me, my memoir, The Best Boy in the United States of America, has a picture of me. I don't know if you can see it. It's that's me. I'm 8 years old on Purim, dressed up as a cowboy. It is Nebraska after all. Well, you know what's in our house? There it is. And our grandchildren, who are now 11 and 8, always ask about Zadie's hat from Texas. Well, it's really from Nebraska. So these objects have great meaning to us, and we should cherish them.
The objects, I just wanted to be sure that Ron knew that I've got a copy of that book, and it's one of my treasures. And he is the best boy. The objects, it turns out, are extremely important. And they are representative of a family history, as Ron says. The objects carry with them a part of the family narrative, but not just the objects itself, but the responsibility for the story itself. I've talked with lots of grandparents over the years, and many of them say, you know, my children don't want the things in our house. Who am I going to give this object to? If we bring one of our children into the house, he said, what do you want? They would say, we want nothing. And what we need to do, I think, is to see that object in much the same way that there's a really wonderful book many of you probably have read called The Source by James Michener. It's this big, thick book. But the story of the source is one in which they find an object on a place called Tel Makor. And Makor is source. And they find this object, this ancient object, and the entire book, this huge book, is built upon the effort to find the source of this object. How did it get to be here in my hand on this hill in Israel? How did the lighter get to Ron's hand? He can tell us some of the history of it. And what will he do with it? What will we do with any objects? I've got objects here, my grandfather's shaving cup from the barber shop in Union City, when you would go and people would have the shave, but they'll have their own shaving cup with a name engraved on it. This is a treasure. And what we need to do is to see these objects, I think, as part of the story that we transmit. And what we need to do, I think, is to say, just as we do with stories, here, listen to this story. I'm giving you this story, but I think the object that Ron describes, the hat, he's going to give it to one of the kids. They're going to want it. And if they don't want it, I would say to them, you're responsible for it. You take this lighter, you keep it. This is your job. And I think that this transmission in object form, in story form, in the hug form, in the red chair that Ron describes, in the lap that we sit on. These are all parts of the stories. We think it's just the content, but it's not.
Can I tell you, it's so true. David, you're asking about objects. I'm going to show everybody the most valuable object that we own, my wife Susie and I. Are you ready? This is called the Recipes for Memories Family Scrapbook Cookbook. It's 400 pages of Susie's collection. First, these are pictures of the family through the generations. And then you open it up, and every page has not only a recipe, it has the stories behind the recipes. My mother, my children's bubby, handwritten recipe for borscht. I want to tell you, it took Susie a full year to put this together. And God forbid, if our house was burning down, this is the book I would grab. Because this is our legacy. This is our family story right here. We wrote the story through these recipes. My favorite page in the book is called Dueling Matzo Balls, because our children's Bubby and Zadie made matzo balls. Susie's father, Zadie K. Kukowka, was from Poland. He made sinkers. Do you know what sinkers are?
Sure.
It's like a golf ball sized matzo ball, goes straight to the bottom of the bowl. My mother, Bubby Wolfson, was from Russia, stocked big matzo balls that float in the bowl. So Susie put the recipes for both matzo balls on one page in this book. When our son Michael saw it, right before Pesach, he was living in Portland. He asked Susie to send him a care package for Pesach. She sent him matzo ball mix. And after the Seder, she asked Michael if he made the matzo ball soup. And he said, the best thing ever. He said, oh yeah, Mom, thank you for sending that matzo ball mix because I used your cookbook. He has a copy of this book. Our daughter has a copy of this book. And he says to Susie, Mom, I made your matzo balls using the cookbook. And Susie couldn't wait to ask him, which recipe did you use? And he said, well, I was going for Bubby, but they came out Zadie. There's a family story we'll be sharing for generations. And because we have the story in the book, it will last forever.
So may I just interject that Ron has a post in the family room exactly about his cookbook, and I've put the link into the chat.
Wonderful.
And one of our participants, you've obviously touched a happy nerve. I can't see the person's name. It just says owner's iPhone. It said he or she wrote, my brother has the blue box. It is a beveled glass box that once held rock candy in our grandparents' Boston apartment. My mom had it before she passed away. We used to joke about who would inherit it. Charles got it. I got Mom's handwritten recipes. Oh gosh, you're talking about that right now. I cherish them all.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Wonderful. We also created a book of all our favorite recipes from our grandmother, and it's one page. And by the way, if people have items around their house that their children won't take, we're suggesting that you send them to Marie Kondo, just for revenge. I want to kind of pick up on this notion of creating a memory soup or a memory stew. That is to say, to create an environment that enables us and empowers us and provides us opportunities to share these stories. It is books, it is objects, it is pictures, it is recipes, it is activities that we do together. And it sounds to me like both of you are saying that in promoting sharing stories, that there has to be props. And surround yourself with the kind of props that probably have enormous meaning to us, but the meaning isn't the object, the meaning is in the memory. And so I wonder whether you want to comment on that, of just creating this basically multi-dimensional platform for sharing our family stories.
Yeah, let me say something about that, because in some of the earlier work that we did, we found that it's not just the content. We can write the content down. And the worst thing we can do is type it. I think if it's handwritten, it's our hand. If it's got coffee spilled on it, it's more meaningful than if it's on a pristine piece of paper. But what we have to realize is that there's both content and process. The content is what the story says, and the process is how it is transmitted. So a lap is better than sitting at a table looking at each other or across a desk. A lap is a good place to tell a story. A bedtime is a good time to tell a story. A Shabbat dinner that has all the things around it, the smells and the tastes and all the other senses. We have a tradition in our family that we make horseradish together each year for Passover. And what this involves is getting horseradish roots and getting all the children together and starting with the root and peeling the horseradish and grinding the horseradish, listening to Shlomo Carlebach music. But before we begin, all the children need to have a taste of slivovitz, which is the worst, most disgusting stuff. Okay, I actually use it to try and find a way to get rid of it, but the children don't know that. So we taste the slivovitz, and they go, it's disgusting. But somewhere in their life, they will taste some slivovitz, and the horseradish will come back, and the time together making the frame for Passover will come back, and the memories of Karbach, and the smells, and all these things will come together. And that's the transmission. It's the transmission of the content, but the content almost becomes secondary because there's an emotional component that's transmitted and a feeling of what it is to have this story. So there are many ways for stories to be told. The objects, I couldn't agree more. If you have a prop, it's a great thing. You could have more complicated props if you would like. If somebody loves slivovitz, I'll send it to you. Let me know. Give me your address.
I wonder, Marshall, I think you're saying something very powerful. You always, and as you do often, what part of what I'm hearing is that when you're sharing when sharing memories, you're also making memories. That just the act of sitting with your grandkids and sharing those stories is creating stories for them to tell for generations to come. Does that sound right?
Well, as we hear, yes, it's very, very much right. And then as we hear from Ron says, I'm telling you a story about a storyteller. He told us a story about the person, his grandfather, who told the story. So he's reporting about a story in a story in a story. And Ron's children will say, my father told me a story that his grandfather told him. And look at how it begins to become more and more complex and reach back further and further in time. So yeah, it's creating a memory, and anything that we can add to make that memory hold on. Repetition, it's fine. I sometimes, I mean, I say it partially in jest, but I say when the grandchildren hear you say, let me tell you a story, and they know the story, or they say, oh my God, no, don't tell that story again. To me, that's success for a grandparent. You know they know the story, they know enough to anticipate it. And the objects, the Ronson lighter becomes just for Ron's son, by the way.
Yeah.
Marshall, we have a question from our participants and it's something that actually intrigues me too and troubles me in a way. Our friend asks, do you have any suggestions on how to interest young children in written stories about grandparents' lives? And could you expand to actually address how to interest children at all in grandparents' life stories?
Mm-hmm. An excellent and very, very important question. Little kids, the stories we tell, not only in how we tell them, but also the content of the stories really depends upon our judgment about the age at which a child needs to hear something or will benefit. Stories are usually told because they serve a purpose. They teach a lesson. They help someone deal with a situation that's difficult for them to face. And the stories, little kids hear little kid stories, big kids hear big kid stories. You know, even in Judaism, you can't read certain things till you're 40. You know, there's a wisdom that says, you know, you're not ready. But in terms of interest, I stopped worrying about interest a long time ago. Because I say to the grandchildren, I use these words, I say, this is me, listen, sit. And I tell them the story. If they're interested, that's fine. I love that. But if they're not interested, I still tell them the story. Why? It's good for you. It's good for you to know this. I give them food, that's good for them. This is also good for their soul. So I know that it's important for some things for them to be interested in, but I also want them to sit and listen. And the fact is, everybody can't be happy all the time. Every activity is not going to be pleasant all the time. I'm saying it should be unpleasant. But sometimes we need to say, listen to the story, it's important. I'm going to tell it to you, and just sit for a moment. So this is part of what we do. With the little kids, you know, we have little kid stories. We play games. We just tell a little bit of the story. We know that, by the way, fragments are really what the ultimate family story is composed of. We never tell the entire family story in one sitting. We never tell the entire family story in a lifetime. We tell bits and pieces, and the kids, like we did, piece them together into their own family narrative. So a story from Ron is a piece of something, but he hears others, the kids hear other stories. And that's the way our own personal narrative is composed. And it may be different, by the way, from the narrative that our siblings have, because they picked out different fragments from the things made available to them. So it's not unusual for families to disagree about a family narrative or a family story. I have things I disagree with my brother all the time. He said, this happened. I said, never happened. What are you talking about?
You know, another thing, Marshall, that strikes me about listening is stories begin with questions. In Judaism, we ask questions all the time. I mean, look at the Passover Seder. You know, they're the questions of the four children, the four questions that children recite. They're the questions that the four children ask. The questions that we grandparents ask our grandchildren about their day to help them tell their stories are critically important. In this new book that I did with Bruce Powell called Raising A+ Human Beings, the last chapter is for grandparents and parents who are partners with schools in raising A+ human beings, kind human beings. And the questions we ask are critical. If you ask your grandchild, what'd you learn in school today? What does the grandchild think? Well, school's important, or science is important. If you ask your grandchild, did you do a mitzvah today? Then doing a good deed is important. Were you kind to another person today? If you ask that of your grandchild, the grandchild hears something different. That what the grandparent values is, am I a kind person? Am I being a bucket filler, not a bucket dipper, as my little kids used to say, little grandkids used to say. So those questions are really, really important. And that begins for the grandchildren to begin to tell their stories and share them with the grandparents. It's really, really quite extraordinary.
And it is, and what you're touching on, Ron, just to tell you a little bit about some research on this, you know, it's certainly less interesting I'm sure, than the stories, but we have, this is a category of stories that Ron describes called Today I stories. And there's a lot of research on Today I stories. What is a Today I story? What did you do in school today? Well, today and then the kid says something that happened. And these are things that happen on a daily basis. They're not the big giant stories. They're what's called co-constructing a family narrative. So at dinner time, which is very important. We can't do it every single day, but the research shows 3 dinners a week together is a pretty good one, you know, to sit down and what did you do today? What happened in school? How were you kind today? Did you do something to help another person? Well, today I helped. And Ron is absolutely right about this, because the questions we ask determine the story. 2 families go to Disney World. One comes back, says we had a great time. The other comes back and said we had a terrible time. What's the difference? They had the exact same experience. The difference is in what did they ask about? What went right? What went wrong? So one family is complaining and the other in the exact same experience. So we really help to construct the stories by the questions that we ask. Absolutely. And questions that they ask us usually provoke a story of some.
By the way, Marshall, one more point on this. The central prayer of Judaism is Shema Yisrael. Listen, people of Israel, right? So listening is a great skill to teach our grandchildren.
Well, it seems as this must be something extraordinarily empowering when we listen to our grandchildren's stories. There's something validating when we sit and demonstrate that we're interested in our grandchildren's stories, no matter what they are. It certainly sends a message that who you are and what you've done is so important. I want to go back, if I can, to something that you said earlier on, Ron, and being the best boy in the United States and kind of living up to that joyful saying of your grandfather. How do you live up to that expectation? How do you be that kind of person?
Well,
Let me finish the question, because you allude to it in kind of different ways in two of your books. One is Raising 8+ Human Beings. You're right. The most important most importantly, grandparents are there to impart wisdom. And in your book, The Best Boy, you write, little did I realize at the time that the traditions of my Zadie and Bubby, our extended family, and my mom and dad would profoundly shape my worldview. So part of what I hear is happening is that, as Marshall says, we have kind of fragments of these narratives that somehow come together to frame our worldview and kind of give us something to aspire to. Does that sound about right?
well, the key word is to aspire to. Even as a young child, a grandchild, I understood what Zadie was saying to me. He wasn't really saying you're the best, because I realized he was saying the same to all the other 8 grandchildren. I got that very early on. What he was saying is, be the best you can be. Remember the old story of the Hasidic Rebbe Zusya, who says, I'm not afraid that when I get to heaven, God will ask me, why weren't you like King David? Or why weren't you like Moses? I am worried he'll ask me, why weren't you Zusya? Why weren't you the best you could be? Some of you might remember the great 20th century jingle commercial, be all that you can be. Remember what it was? Find your future in the army. Yeah, be all that you can be. That's what Zadie was saying to us. He was saying, Ronnie, be the best you can be. Not perfect. No one's perfect. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but be the best human being you can be. That's what he wanted for us. And I got that early on through his Russian accent. No question about it. So I think that the role of us as grandparents is certainly to support our grandchildren, to inspire our grandchildren, to give them aspirational hopes and dreams, to share the stories of our aspirations and hopes and dreams, and even some of our disappointments. I don't think it's something that we should shy away from in telling some of the difficult challenges we faced in life. I think that becomes really the grist of a great family experience. And every sociologist I've read who has studied Jewish identity formation says that grandparents are among the greatest influences on Jewish identity of all the influences: day schools, summer camps, religious schools, synagogue, all of JCCs, all that's important. But we as grandparents have unbelievable power in shaping the identity of our kids if we want them to have a deep Jewish neshama, a deep Jewish soul.
I'd like to ask Marshall one more question before we take questions from everybody else. And Ron, you alluded to this, that it's not all about sharing the good things and sharing the good things all the time. Marshall, I don't know, could you talk a little bit about oscillating narratives and why they're important?
Yeah, sure.
To share?
I was certainly thinking about that. Yeah, Ron touches a very important point, and that is that in the research that we did, we looked at the shape of family stories, what's the general tenor of the story, and there are really 3 major forms of family stories. There's an ascending narrative, which essentially says we had nothing and we worked and worked and worked, and now we have all these things. There's a descending family narrative, which is like many times you find after an economic downturn, we were doing okay, but then the depression came, or the economic downturn of the 1980s came, or 2008, and these stories are down stories. But the most healthful story that we found, and really if people allow it to be the case, the most realistic story that there is an oscillating family narrative. That is, we have good things to tell you about, but there are also some bad things that happened in the history of our family. And again, judgment is required as to when and which bad things we share with the kids. But it's important that they hear about troubles, difficult times. COVID is one of them. We'll be telling this story about what happened, about being locked down for generations. But in every family, there are times when the family was challenged, when they had trouble, when someone lost a job, when a house burned down, there was a tragedy, an accident, a car accident. Maybe somebody was lost in the war. There are bad things in the stories and of any family. And many times people say, oh, I'm only going to tell the good stories. But in fact, as Arlo Guthrie once said, you can't have any light without a little dark to put it in. There's contrast that you can have a brighter positive if you have a darker negative to compare it against. And what we usually do is we tell stories in times that are safe. We're at a dinner, we're at Thanksgiving, we're at Passover, we're sitting together. And we kids hear stories about bad things that happened in the family. But the message usually is, this is how we got past it. This is how we rose above it. This is how we dealt with it. These are the resources we use. This is who we turned to. And if we didn't get over it or couldn't, we learned how to live with it. And we found ways to do that. And these are all lessons for the kids. For when they come upon in their life a situation like that, they have a family that they belong to that has dealt with this kind of stuff. And they might remember the specifics, but more than likely, they're going to remember the mindset. And that is, we deal with things. We find ways to rise above. We come back. That's the family I belong to. And they carry this and own this story. And once they own the story, they become responsible for the story, but they also become responsible to the story. That means that, as Ron said, you live a life that reflects the story. You live the best possible life you can that reflects the story. You may not achieve perfection, but what you do is you say, I'm responsible to this story. I come from a family that gives tzedakah. I come from a family that does Pesach every year. I come from a family who does kind things for other people. I come from a family that doesn't get into trouble with school or with the law. These are the kinds of things that help guide kids. And that's the gift that we give them when we give them the family narrative.
Marshall, Judy is asking on this very note, how do you handle the stories when they are especially painful, for example, with regard to relatives who have or had mental illness?
Well, just from a pure medical or psychological point of view, if there are certain kinds of disorders mental disorders in a family, especially mood disorders, the kids need to know about these because sometimes they tend to run in a family a little bit more than other kinds of things. But they need to know that there have been illnesses. They need to know that the family has pulled together, how they dealt with these. And there are certain stories that are not shared. There are generational stories that a particular generation decides they will not transmit. There are family secrets. And just sort of like without deciding officially, a generation will not transmit a certain bit of information. And sometimes it has to do with a criminal act. Sometimes it has to do with suicide. Sometimes it has to do with some other kind of thing, like a really bad business decision or something of that sort that got the family into trouble. They don't pass this on. Usually stories that are passed on have lesson value, lessons. This is why if somebody's giving I do this in my classes, or if Ron is giving a sermon, and if you lose in the group, you say, let me tell you a story. And everybody comes back, because we just know if I'm going to hear a story, I'm going to be better for it in some way, either now or in the future. So I think that there are probably some stories, I agree, that we keep to ourselves, but most stories over time can be transmitted. I can tell you that my mother-in-law, rest her soul, when she was 97, told my wife a story that she had never told her.
Huh.
And it was only because I think she lost her ability to inhibit telling the story. I don't think she was going to tell it. I don't think she was going to tell it, but she did tell it. So I hope that answers.
Yes, thank you very much. David, okay if I ask another question from the participants? Perhaps Ron, perhaps you could speak to this. Grandma Jilly writes, and Grandma Jilly wants us to know that she is Grandma Jilly of 6 treasures in North San Diego County. We love our grandmas. Jilly is asking, a challenge today is competing with cell phones and iPads. Not allowed at Grandma Shabbat table, but I get groans with 3 exclamation marks. Help! Exclamation mark.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what we do. We now have our grandchildren nearby, and we celebrate Shabbat together. And when the meal is over, well, before the meal, the phones are put away. You know, amongst the millennials, there's a project from the Reboot group to deconnect, to disconnect your cell phones and your iPads and so on, and give it a rest for, if not the whole day, a couple of hours. And we play games. Susie has a great game that we play. We play a game called Never Have I Ever, where you ask a question and you hold up a paddle that says I have or I have not. I never have I ever. Our little grandson, 8 years old, answered the question, have you ever called 911? And he put up the paddle that said, I have. 8 years old. And it turns out that his father had said to him before he was along the way, if you ever have a problem, you should call 911. Well, he was working on a math worksheet. So he called 911. And we couldn't believe it. We said, no, you're making it up, Gabe. He said, no, he got very indignant. He said, I did call 911. And we said, what did the operator say? The operator said, well, the answer is 4, and next time only call in emergencies. The question was, what's 2 + 2? We carve out time, sacred time, to be in relationship with each other. And I think that's something we grandparents can insist on. We have to sometimes negotiate with the adults, with the parents for that time. But I think that's something that's precious in our family, and I recommend it.
Thank you, Ron. We have about 5 minutes left together, so I think we have time possibly for 2 more quick questions. Nancy's asking, how do you suggest sharing stories about our parents' survival of the Holocaust? At what age and in what way?
Oh, wow. Can I jump in on that? Because in our dining room, we have a little table, and underneath like a buffet table, underneath the buffet table is a valise from 1951, a suitcase. And on the side of it, it is written in marker, G. Kukafka, Fort Worth, Texas, Jewish Community Center. And this was discovered by our son in the basement of his Zadie's house, Zadie K., the Polish guy with the sinkers. And he asked his grandfather, what's the story behind this valise? And it turned out to be the valise, the suitcase, owned by his brother, George G. Kukafka, when he, his wife, Bubby K, and Uncle George made the trip from Berlin, Germany, with a little baby named Sura Kukafka, now known as Susie Wolfson, in 1951, to Fort Worth, Texas, in 1951, as kind of refugees from Germany, if you will. And they were all Holocaust survivors, all of them, all three, the Bubby, the Zadie, and Uncle George. And Fort Worth, Texas quota from the Jewish community was filled when they arrived there. So they were sent to Omaha, Nebraska. Susie says we were sent to Omaha so I can meet you, Ronnie. Is that the sweetest thing you ever heard? So
she was always very smart.
We have that suitcase in a proud position in our dining room. And now our grandchildren are asking about the story of that suitcase. Circling back to the objects, right?
Yeah, circling back to the object. And if the objects are not there, we know that the grandchildren of survivors and the children of survivors very often don't really know a story or don't even have an object like this. More common than you would imagine. And in fact, we studied the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors as a special group because they didn't follow the finding that the more you know about your family story, the more resilient you are, because it turns out that the Holocaust grandchildren, so-called 3G group, third generation, are very strong, very capable, very adapted, resilient. And when we actually met with many of the grandchildren who did not know the stories, because you know what happened, the survivors did not really want to tell the stories very often, and their children didn't ask them because they didn't want to upset them. Right. And so there's something in the Holocaust grandchildren literature that's called the double wall of silence. The survivors did not want to speak. The children didn't ask them. And so the children didn't know the story to transmit to their children, and the grandparents didn't transmit the stories. But now there are groups all over the world called 3G groups. I just got a note from one up in Boston, 3G, third generation. These are the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who are trying to find out what happened to their grandparents, because the family itself may not have the story, but they can find fragments and they can find general kinds of experiences, and they create stories about what happened to their grandparents, not necessarily based upon what the grandparents told them. But I know my grandmother was in Treblinka. I'm at a Holocaust museum. I see what Treblinka looks like. These are the things my grandmother saw. And they build a story. And the most important thing that we have learned from them, the 3G group, is that they feel they own the story. And it's not a specific one, but they own a story about what happened. And if we can help them by providing fragments, details, objects, the suitcase is a great example of an object, because many of the grandchildren say their parents or their grandparents didn't tell them things specifically, but they watched their grandparents' behavior, like a grandparent who would not allow anyone to leave food on a plate, like a grandparent who picked up all the spoons and counted them to be sure they were all there. And if you go back and you'll learn about why that was important. If you had a spoon, you ate. So out of fragments, the grandchildren of the survivors build stories that belong to them. And they transmit them. By the way, we asked them, at what age do you tell your children, now the great-grandchildren, the story of their great-grandparents? And the most common age was around 12. They felt that their kids could begin to hear these stories. Yep. That's just based upon grandchildren of Holocaust survivors telling us when they would tell their children. So it seemed to be a reasonable age to be able to hear these things.
I want to ask one very, very quick question related to that. You speak about children owning the story of their family's survival or being perished during the Holocaust. I just wonder, that is really our Jewish story. That is our shared story. And I just feel that all of us need to own a piece of that as well. And so when we're thinking about family memories, part of the broader context is how we think about our own Jewish stories and our own Jewish memories.
Absolutely.
Friends, usually we like to end these sessions a few minutes early, right? And that was my goal. However, I must tell you, we've got some remaining very intriguing questions. If you must leave, we will say goodbye, and many, many thanks for being here. We are recording the session and we'll post it in our Facebook group, and I've put the link for you to join our Facebook group in chat. I do hope you'll stay, and perhaps we'll run over by 2 or 3 minutes. The first of the remaining 2 questions, I believe, is from Judy, who asks a poignant question, very important. Having grandchildren on the other side of the country is very challenging. We do a FaceTime call once a week, but it feels more superficial. The children are 9 and 6, and it's hard to keep their attention. Do you have any advice on long-distance grandparenting?
Well,
go ahead,
go
Ron.
ahead. No, Marshall, please.
I was going to ask David. We know that there's some data on this, isn't there, about what percentage of grandparents live far
We
away?
know that, well, 2 things that we know. We know that 40% of grandparents live 5 hours or more from their grandkids by car, bus, or train. We know that before COVID, about 40% of grandparents reported that they had engaged in some kind of video communication in the last year, and now that number has more than doubled. And I think kind of video or remote communication with our grandkids is something that's here to stay. And 2 things. One is, I think the trick is, how do we think about making that more 3-dimensional? That's to say, instead of just saying, hi grandkid, how you doing? Try to create activities that extend beyond the screen, which is something we've attempted to do with the family room, and we invite you to visit that. And there was another thing I was going to say, and now I don't remember what it was.
Well,
go ahead, Ron.
I can jump in. Back to Raising A+ Human Beings, our chapter on grandparenting and parenting talks about supper. And I know grandparents that eat on Zoom with their grandchildren. Okay. By the way, you can get a word from your sponsor, aplushumanbeings.com. But no, I think it's great. Establishing a regular time is also important. We do, when our grandkids and kids were not living near door to us in Northern California, it was Friday night. It was Shabbat dinner. Shabbat dinner was the time we would gather together on Zoom, and we would give the traditional family blessings over Zoom. We would just, and if you don't know the Hebrew, just that family sandwich of saying, God bless you, we love you. To this day, we call our adult children, who are 45 and 43, to give them blessings. And when they don't answer the phone on Friday night, we leave it on their voicemail. And it's not for them, it's for me. It's for Susie. Do the religious stuff, the Jewish stuff for yourself, and your grandkids will notice that it's not just a show for the children. It's something that's deep in you.
And let me just add to that very wise thing that Ron just said, is that we know that the children benefit from hearing the family stories. But more recently, we've learned that the tellers of the stories are affirmed by telling them, and that the tellers benefit as much, maybe even more, than the children do. It affirms us, it affirms our lives, it affirms our experiences. And so, yes, it's for us. We tell them for us as well as for them.
Thank you. Thank you. Renee, our friend Renee, asks, any thoughts about storytelling in interfaith families?
Well, I have a quick thought I wanted to share, if I may. So our son-in-law, who we adore, is an extraordinary young man, and we were so in love with him. He's a Jew by choice. I like to say that his family came over on the Mayflower. They did. my family came over in steerage. His great something grandmother was a woman named Sybil Ludington, who was the woman Paul revered during during the Revolutionary War. And I think what we're seeing is how his family stories enrich our lives. That is to say that the bringing together of our broader histories and our broader experiences have made all of our family experiences so much richer and so much more interesting. His uncle was in the CIA, and he brings stories to our family experiences that really enrich us in so many ways.
Ron, Marshall, anything to add? Because we have several people who are
I would just say
interested.
it's just more stories. It's more stories. If you have interfaith families, there's more stories. Same thing with the adopted children. They get the story of the family that adopted them, but they also might learn something about a biological family that they had. The more you know, the more sources of knowledge and sense of self that come to you. So I don't think we should be selective, in any sort of mixed family, or tell the stories.
Yeah, the grandchildren are going to hear stories from both sides of the family,
Yes,
and
they
that's
are.
fine.
Sure. Sure.
It's like when people ask me, can I go to the people who are not Jewish for Christmas? I say it's one thing to appreciate somebody else's holiday. It's not yours. But certainly we have to honor and appreciate the stories that come from the folks that are not Jewish.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. We are going to call it a night. David, Marshall, Ron, thank you for a most wonderful, informative evening. If you can take a quick look down the chat or save the chat, you will see that there are many thanks from our participants for a most
Wonderful.
engaging and wonderful conversation. Again, we are recording it. We will post the recording by the end of the week in our Facebook group. We invite you all to join. And thank you for being here. We will be hosting more events like this. We will let you know. So the next Family Room Live webinar will be on raising grandchildren in an inclusive way, grandchildren with disabilities, and how to celebrate all our grandchildren. So that will be presented by a specialist in inclusion and children with disabilities. To all of you, have a wonderful evening, and thank you so very, very much for being here.
Thank you all.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night,
Good night.
everyone. Thank you. Ron,